Hey everybody, Aaron Rift here from NoDQ.com to talk about some of the worst pay-per-view events in wrestling history. Now, there have been a lot of bad pay-per-views, but there are ones that stand out more than others. I asked people on Facebook and Twitter for their input, and I got a huge list here of pay-per-views. To be honest, I don't even remember a lot of the matches on these shows, but I'm going to try to go through some of these and give my thoughts and if I think they are among the worst pay-per-views or not. Let's start off with two of the Survivor Series pay-per-views from 2008 and 2009. Certainly not good pay-per-views. I don't know if I would call them among the worst pay-per-views ever, but when you look at Survivor Series pay-per-views, they would definitely be at the bottom. 2008, I remember that really bad Triple H versus Kozlov match. It was originally supposed to be a triple threat. Triple H versus Jeff Hardy and Edge, but then you had Kozlov out there because Jeff Hardy was injured in storyline, and that was just brutal. I mean, it was one of the worst WWE title matches on pay-per-view I could ever recall, and the rest of the show was just bland. John Cena beat Chris Jericho for the world title, and Undertaker beat Big Show, and the Survivor Series matches were just okay matches, nothing special. And same thing with 2009, just a very forgettable Survivor Series card. And the build-up for the main event, it was John Cena versus Shawn Michaels versus Triple H. I mean, that was one of the worst build-ups for a pay-per-view main event ever. It was built around Hornswoggle, so I mean, that tells you all you need to know. SummerSlam 2007, really dull pay-per-view. There was really no good match on the show. I mean, a match that people remember, a week later. I mean, I tend to remember the only entertaining thing on that entire pay-per-view was Vince McMahon backstage doing the crime time dance and William Regal joining in, and they were all going, money, money, yeah, yeah. Besides that, I mean, the rest of the pay-per-view sucked. John Cena versus Randy Orton was a big letdown. Edge and John Cena was a letdown, and the match just ended in controversy and just led up to the next month's match. So it was not a good show at all. And the Victory Road pay-per-views from 2009 and 2011. I think the 2009 Victory Road is remembered because of the Jenna Maraska versus Charmel match and how awful that one was. That was just a terrible match, and the pay-per-view itself was very forgettable. And that was a period when the Main Event Mafia was getting all the wins, and they weren't really putting over the younger talent. And it really showed on this pay-per-view. In Victory Road 2011. Another bland pay-per-view from TNA. Okay matches, but it's the main event that everybody remembers. The 90-second main event. People bought the pay-per-view to see Sting and Jeff Hardy for the TNA title, and Jeff Hardy's in no condition to perform, and the main event goes 90 seconds, and that's the end of the pay-per-view. So, I mean, that pay-per-view is a disaster in that regard. The Great American Bash 1991. This pay-per-view was a disaster because Ric Flair had just left WCW and was heading to WWE, and the crowd was completely dead for this entire show. They were just chanting, "We want Flair," all night long, and Lex Luger won the title, but nobody cared. And nobody cared about the matches on the entire show. And you had, the undercard was terrible. You had guys like Oz in the undercard. I mean, it was awful. Capital Punishment from 2011. This is a pay-per-view where you built it up around John Cena versus R-Truth. The only problem is that R-Truth was booked like he was inferior to pretty much everybody. You had R-Truth getting himself counted out to avoid John Cena, and that's how you build him up as a challenger for the match. And the rest of the pay-per-view was, just very subpar. It felt like another episode of Raw, but you had to pay $50, $60 for it. Fall Brawl 1998. This was, there were so many bad WCW pay-per-views. You could do a whole list of just WCW shows. Fall Brawl stands out because the main event was just a disaster. The crowd didn't care about anything. You had the Ultimate Warrior coming out with the trapdoor and the smoke and all that, and nobody cared. DDP ended up winning the match, and he got no reaction. The crowd just hated this entire show. And, there were no really good matches or anything. Most of the matches were bad, in fact, from what I remember. And speaking of bad WCW pay-per-views, the uncensored pay-per-views. 1995 and 1996. The 1995 pay-per-view, this idea that every match would have a stipulation, it just backfired big time. You had this King of the Road match with Blacktop Bully and Dustin Rhodes, and they had blood in it. But I mean, the match itself, they were trying to film it, in a helicopter looking down at a truck. It was just so bad and just so unbearable to watch. And Dustin Rhodes ended up being fired, I guess, for a blade job or whatever. It was stupid. And, you had a boxer versus wrestler match. And the main event, Hulk Hogan and Vader. And then the debut of the Renegade, this Ultimate Warrior knockoff. I mean, it was just one bad match after another. And then Uncensored 96, you had Hogan and Savage against the Dungeon of Doom and then the cage match of Doom or whatever. And that was awful. And the undercard was bad as well. I mean, it was just a very lousy pay-per-view. I mean, that's the only way I can put it. And certainly, it's those two Uncensoreds have been, talked about as the worst pay-per-views for years. Next up, WrestleMania 27. This pay-per-view was just a huge disappointment. I don't know if I'd call it among the worst pay-per-views ever, but it was a big letdown. And, you had the main event with John Cena and The Miz with The Rock there. The Miz was a big player. He's a WWE champion, but nobody took him seriously, and WWE wasn't pushing him as champion. And they had the thing where they both got counted out, and then The Rock comes out and cost Cena the match. It was basically just an advertisement for next year's WrestleMania, and people were very let down by that. Bash at the Beach 2000, and the follow-up to that, New Blood Rising. Bash at the Beach 2000, everyone remembers that for Hulk Hogan walking out and then Vince Russo coming out and cutting a work-to-shoot promo on Hulk Hogan in the ring. And it actually led to Hulk Hogan really leaving WCW for good, and the whole lawsuit and all that against WCW. He got mad that Russo called him a bald son of a bitch. I'm serious here, too. And, these pay-per-views, you just had really bad booking from top to bottom. New Blood Rising, you had Goldberg breaking the script, so the WCW was basically admitting that wrestling was fake. This was just WCW at its absolute worst, both of these pay-per-views. Super Brawl 2000, that same year, Russo wasn't involved in this one, but still an awful pay-per-view. You had James Brown come out completely unannounced, which is stupid. I mean, if you're going to have James Brown on your pay-per-view, you might want to announce it in advance, and maybe some people will buy the pay-per-view. So, I mean, that was stupid, and I think you had Tank Abbott pull a knife on some guy. I mean, it was just nothing good on this show. I mean, I remember it just being a really bad pay-per-view. King of the Ring 95, perhaps the worst King of the Ring. I think that, most people would remember this one being among the worst. And this was during a very dark period in WWE. The wrestling on this show was terrible. You had Mabel winning and becoming King Mabel. The pay-per-view, the fans in attendance were so bored with it, they were chanting ECW. And I think that was a point where Vince realized he needed to start changing his product and going in a different direction, because the crowd just completely crapped on the entire show. WrestleMania 11, definitely one of the worst WrestleManias, and usually when fans look back at the worst WrestleManias, this one's at the top of the list. I think that the Lawrence Taylor stuff with Bam Bam Bigelow was okay, but the undercard was awful. Undertaker and King Kong Bundy, and even Bret Hart's match with Bob Backlund, and usually you can rely on Bret Hart to have a great match. It was not good. And Shawn Michaels and Diesel was okay, but people wanted to see Shawn Michaels win the title, and Diesel retained, and the crowd was booing Diesel. And now let's look at what I would call the 3 worst pay-per-views of all time. First off, December to Dismember. This was pretty much the death blow for the revival of ECW in 2006. This pay-per-view was such a disaster. It bombed on pay-per-view. It did, I think, the lowest pay-per-view buy rate ever in WWE for any pay-per-view. And then the quality was certainly not at the level you would expect for a pay-per-view. They had the Elimination Chamber match, and Bobby Lashley went over, nobody wanted to see that. People either wanted to see RVD win it or CM Punk win it. And RVD was eliminated, and then after that, nobody cared about the match. And the rest of the show was just very disappointing and not what you expect from ECW. It was a big step down from the one night stand pay per views, and there were no ECW pay per views after that. So I mean, this was the beginning of the end for ECW as the third brand. I mean, after this, it definitely wasn't pushed as hard that it was prior. The number 2 worst pay per view of all time, WrestleMania 9. Everyone points to this as the worst WrestleMania, and I tend to agree. It just nothing on the show was that interesting. In fact, you had more bad matches than good matches. You had Undertaker and Giant Gonzalez. You had a very disappointing main event with Bret Hart and Yokozuna. You had Hulk Hogan come out. You know, when I was a kid at the time, I thought it was cool, but looking back, I mean, it was bad for business, and it was making Bret Hart look second rate. So it was a very bad pay per view in terms of quality and in terms of booking and getting the characters over. The up and coming characters and the guys that are going to be carrying the company in the future. And finally, the number 1 worst pay per view of all time. Some of you may not be familiar with it, but if you're not, you can check it out on YouTube. The Heroes of Wrestling. This is an independent group that did this pay-per-view, and it was basically a bunch of guys that were in their prime 15 years earlier. This pay-per-view was in 1999, and you had the Iron Sheik, Nikolai Volkov, Yokozuna. Yokozuna was close to death. I mean, this was less than a year before he died, and he did not look good at all. And just a bunch of guys that couldn't go anymore, and it was one terrible match after another. And I think people remember this the most for Jake Roberts' promo. He was on something or drunk or whatever, and he talked about blackjack. You want to play 21? I got 22. That infamous Jake Roberts promo, and then he had the snake during the match, and he was stroking it like it was his penis. Yeah. So check it out on YouTube, Heroes of Wrestling. I think Botchamania dedicated a whole episode to it. So search for it online. I'm sure you can find clips of it, but beware. It is very hard to watch. That'll do it for my thoughts on the worst pay-per-views in history. And there's a lot of them. I'm sure there's plenty that I didn't mention. I tried to mention the ones that stand out the most as being bad pay-per-views. For some of these pay-per-views, it was one match or one incident that left such a bad taste in people's mouths. But some of these pay-per-views from top to bottom were horrendous. So let me know what you think, which pay-per-views you thought were the worst in history. YouTube.com/NoDQCW. Leave a comment, and stay tuned to NoDQ.com for all the very latest in WWE and TNA. Thanks for watching.